All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? We good for the, okay. Thank you so much for coming to my talk, Decision Analysis Applications in Threat Analysis Frameworks. I realize that is a lot of words. I really appreciate everyone coming out today. This research actually came out of work that I did as part of my master's program for my thesis this past year. Just a little bit about me to start that kind of informs where I went with this research. So my bachelor's degree was actually in psychology and political science, which then getting into cybersecurity was kind of a big leap from that. I actually came very, very close to going for my PhD in cognitive science. When I say very, very close, I mean I had filled out the applications and was sitting there ready to hit submit and realized that I was already tired of the research that I had talked about doing for 5 years. So did not end up doing that. I went to Carnegie Mellon University and just graduated this year with my master's in public policy with a concentration in cybersecurity management. So it's sort of more of a non-technical security degree. And even still, having not gone for my PhD in cognitive science, I still love that field. I love the concept of decision making, the human factors in life, and the concept that people are generally predictable. So that's kind of where I went with this research. Real quick, here's just some things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go into the background of the work that's out there that informed me in this research, my methodology, and how I went about doing the work, the framework that I created as an example, and some of the kind of future directions that I hope this research can eventually take. And if there's time, which there almost certainly will be, I will take questions. So one of the things that's kind of a hot button issue right now is the human factor of security. The fact that security is a little bit too much about bits and bytes and we need to start considering the people in the process. We're getting a lot better at considering the human factor, but really when we think about the human factor of security, the thing we think about is the internet grandma. The human is the vulnerability. The adversary, on the other hand, is still the hacker in the hoodie with no face. And adversaries are also human, and that's a perspective that we need to consider a little bit more, I believe. As humans, adversaries have consistencies, especially when you're looking at established adversaries like advanced persistent threats, APTs, that have a very established MO. So when you're considering these human factors, we really want to look at decisions. Hackers are making decisions when they're attacking you. And there's some game theory applications about cybersecurity. They're very, very mathy, very in the weeds. And so I kind of took some of that research and decided to develop that as something that's a little bit more manageable for like a management standpoint. One of the concepts in game theory is the prisoner's dilemma, which if you're not familiar with it, it's if you have two prisoners that are caught and accused of a crime, you put them in separate rooms and you tell them if they confess, they'll get a lessened sentence. But if neither of them confesses, then they can't prove that they did the crime. So each prisoner is sitting in a separate room trying to guess what the other person is going to do. And basically what that means is you're trying to guess what the other person does, and you often settle for a suboptimal outcome to protect yourself against a really bad outcome. So I had to go about choosing an approach for this research, and my dream in doing this was to get aggregated pen test data, because pen testers kind of simulate adversaries, and for me that would have been a great opportunity to kind of look at emulated adversary behavior and aggregate that data. Unfortunately, no one will let me have company pen test data. That wasn't going to happen. So I said, okay, never mind, that won't work. What if I can get just one anonymized group to sign off on letting me use their pen test data? My advisor was very confident that we would be able to get one group to let me do this. No, did not happen. Did not happen. So as I'm a quarter of the way into the semester and realizing that I don't have a lot of time and I need to make a decision, I said, okay, we're going to take a more theoretical approach. And that was how I decided to model this using advanced persistent threats, because that was what was available to me. So to kind of develop this framework and make a model, I chose two fairly well-known APTs, APT10 and Turtle Group. APT10 I chose because it's a very well-known group. It has a very established MO. It's taken credit for a lot of big deal attacks. And also I knew because of all of the tactics they use, it was going to be super overwhelming, so I kind of took that as a challenge for myself. And then Turla Group I chose because they're very simple. They only go about attacks a couple of different ways, and I figured that was going to be a more manageable tree to kind of present. So I wanted to incorporate elements of existing frameworks rather than reinventing the wheel. So I started with the Cyber Kill Chain from Lockheed Martin, which probably most people are familiar with. And then I also, at the urging of my advisor, looked into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which ended up being kind of the groundwork for what I did. So here's the Cyber Kill Chain for anyone who's not familiar. It's a 7-step process. It's very linear, and it's pretty much tailored solely toward advanced persistent threats. So basically what happens with the kill chain is the concept that an adversary goes through each of these 7 steps. It's a very linear process, and the intent is that if an attack is stopped at any step of this chain, the attack is considered failed. The MITRE ATT&CK framework goes into much more specific kind of granular detail about the various steps of the attack process. It was kind of my launch point because it's still kind of linear in nature, but it goes very much into the specific tactics that an adversary uses. So my process in developing this framework and the process that I believe an organization could use to apply this is to start by identifying the top threats. So for a company to do this, they would want to look at adversaries that are common to their industry, to their company size, whether they're a small or large organization, even their geographic location. There are various reports put out by different organizations every year that kind of allow for this. So then I looked into the attack methods of those threat actors. So for me, that was my 2 chosen APTs. And I got a lot of reference from MITRE and from Rapid7 about these adversaries, and certainly that kind of work exists for various groups. So then I actually built the decision tree, which I will show you in a minute. So basically, starting with the primary methods of attack from a group, which I found was often spear phishing, and then going into how they progress through an attack process, and then kind of going from there into what if that doesn't work? What if a step in that process fails? And my vision for this is that an organization could synthesize this with their own weaknesses as identified in a risk assessment or a vulnerability assessment. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and show you my first tree. So this is the one I made for Turla Group. This one's pretty manageable. I take for granted that when I present, I can walk and touch the screen. So bear with me here. So going from left to right, I hope you can read that, but basically starting with Turla's initial point of entry is pretty much always spear phishing. So we look at what happens if they're successful, that's what's on the top, and then they move on to process discovery, malware execution, etc. That stage of successes is generally what would be considered the kill chain. So basically, the goal is to foil one of those things in the middle, and that is obviously the first goal because those are the things that we know could be the biggest threat. However, what I want to focus on is the failure steps that are not true failures. So if there is, in fact, a failure, there are still alternate methods that the group can use. So we look into brute force attacks, lateral movement, things that the attacker could use should their initial attack fail. So the things that I really realized were the most critical places for an organization to look at is those nodes that go one way red and one way green. So those are really the things to look at as, oh, that is my do or die point. I don't want to reach that point. So how can I roll that back a step or two and look into how I can kind of head that off towards the beginning? Or conversely, what are the red steps where the alternate isn't a green? That would be a great place to say, hey, we can terminate this attack before it ever reaches a point where we're going to break. So I'm going to show you my second tree. This one is for APT 10. I am not going to walk through this one because this one is much more complicated. This is actually the simplified version because this is assuming they start with spearfishing, which is largely but not entirely the case. So this can get very complicated very fast is the point I'm trying to make with this. So it's definitely important to kind of prioritize this, and maybe this is a person's job is to build something like this and then boil it back down to those critical reds and greens or just reds and to take that back to management. So some of my limitations in this process and some future directions I hope this could go. The first thing is this is obviously very theoretical. A lot of kind of game theory research has some pretty serious math foundations to it with probability and such. That's something I would love to see in the future. I am not a probability person. That is not my thing. But that's something that I would love to see kind of partnered with someone with those math foundations in the future. Also, obviously, I'm working with static data about a well-known group. That's not as effective as live organization-specific info, and it didn't allow me to do all the things that I initially wanted when I was hoping to get that pen test data. I hope to work with someone in the future about that, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately, but I am employed by a corporation at this point, so I'm limited in my ability to work with other organizations on this. But certainly, if that was something anyone was ever interested in, I'd love to talk to them about it. So just to kind of wrap this up, hopefully this framework can be applied by companies someday in the future to help prioritize their mitigation. So we know where our vulnerabilities and what the biggest risks are. How can we overlay that with the threat landscape that is most critical to our industry, to our size, our location, and kind of prioritize those mitigations. It can also allow for personalization of the corporate policy, find where you're likely to be targeted, fit your risk with your specific threats. And also, kind of calling back to this, I used this for APTs because that was what I had access to. It's not just for that. You could very easily build a tree for the disgruntled employee, the script kiddie. Those would obviously be much more complicated because you're looking at a way bigger method of attack. But that's certainly something that could be done and could be boiled down to something manageable to hand back to a management setting. All right, so at this point, I'm going to open it up to questions. There's my contact information. Follow me on Twitter. I talk about, issues in cybersecurity, women in tech, or fun things like how on the plane here I spilled coffee on my only pair of jeans. So yeah, if we have any questions at this point, I'd love to hear them. Yep.
Why do you think that your contract for work employment is integrated? You've been working with others?
It does not, but I just have to be careful. It's industry dependent. But I can talk to people on a one-on-one basis about that.
Gotcha. Because us in pen tests, we just collectively work on stuff
Mm-hmm.
on a massive scale,
Yep.
regardless of who we work for. For the most part.
I know.
So it's kind of like, why do you feel restricted? Because we can help you. It would be a wonderful research project.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'd love to talk to you more about it. Back there?
What sort of things were you unable to do because you didn't have access to that?
So I was very limited to trying to pick an adversary as opposed to trying to emulate what a company would do. So I had to kind of just guess at how someone would work if they knew APT-10 was their biggest threat, as opposed to taking a company for whom APT-10 is a concern and fitting their risk profile in with the work that I did. Does that make sense?
So you're working from the threat actor in. How hard would it be to reverse that and say we have this data set or whatever that we want to protect and work through the chain backwards?
That would definitely be something that would be interesting to look at. I think the same process could definitely apply. I think that's also something that maybe has been done a little bit with fault trees and such. Anyone else? All right, thank you so much.